Yeah, let me ask you a few questions then.
Sure.
So, you're the producer of The Last Ice, and that's quite an incredible and comprehensive film about the fate of the Arctic, climate change, global commerce, and politics. How did you begin the film, and what inspired you as a person to gain a larger view of all of this?
So the film actually began, I work for an ocean conservation initiative with National Geographic called Pristine Seas. And what we do with them is we go around the world on expedition and we make 30 to 40-minute documentaries. We have a science team who creates baseline surveys of the marine area. And then we push for policy to have marine protected areas created. Now, about 5 years ago, my boss, Enric Sala, who's the marine ecologist who began the program, said we should start looking to the Arctic, find out if there's anything we can do up there to support any efforts. And so when we started doing our preliminary research, I mean, it became obvious right away, this needs to be a feature. This isn't like the other places we go that are kind of self-contained. The Arctic is just obviously a much, much bigger story, and it's going to be a much bigger and more epic thing to communicate to an audience. So that's how the idea to make a feature came about. Now, when we started, it was kind of a straight ahead wildlife and sea ice story. It was the sad polar bear drifting off on the lone piece of ice with the tear coming down, that sort of thing. And then, the sea ice is disappearing. But that all went out the window on our first trip, because that's when we started in Inuit communities and filming, and really it started with going out on the ice with Inuit guides. And I think within the first week, it was everyone decided this needs to be a film about people, because that's what this story is actually about. There's tens of thousands of Inuit who live across the Arctic, and the area that we were focusing on, the reason the film's called The Last Ice is because there's an area called the Last Ice Area. And that is the ocean between Nunavut, Canada, and Greenland, which is where the last summer sea ice is predicted to be in 2040, before we lose all of the summer sea ice. And so as the sea ice is melting toward this one area, all of the wildlife is starting to migrate toward it and concentrate in this really dense section of the Arctic, which Inuit, of course, rely on wildlife for subsistence hunting. They rely on the ice for transportation. It's tied in culturally. It's tied to food security. So it's this extremely invaluable, but also fragile area. So then, as we started to tell the story of that area, and we started to speak to more and more Inuit, the entire context of all of the present moment started to unfold. So everything from the historical mistreatment and very recent and ongoing mistreatment of Inuit by outsiders, colonizers, governments, industry, even a history of filmmakers mistreating. All of that colored what was happening now. And then, of course, as the ice is melting and you have lots of economic drivers and geopolitical drivers for people to come into the same area, the future is looking rather bleak. So being able to, and sorry, this is a very long answer to your question.
Sure. No, it's quite a good answer.
So being able to put all of these things into context, but also to offer maybe a solution, an achievable, a tangible solution to an overwhelming problem. The overwhelming problem being climate change, and the tangible solution in the film being protecting this one area, the Pikialasorsuaq, which is a co-managed area proposal between Inuit and Greenland and Nunavut. That is an actual tangible solution in the Arctic that will provide a sustainable livelihood and sustainable culture for Inuit, which I think is something that's been missing from climate change documentaries. I think the sort of elephant in the room is that even if you hit all the numbers from the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement, and you reduce emissions and everything, the timescales of reversing the ice loss are generational. I mean, that's just not going to happen. So if you're looking at the reality of what's happening today with the ice melting very quickly, I think it's good to focus on solutions that can be put in place right now that are realistic and, most importantly, are supported by the indigenous groups that actually live in the areas that are going to be most affected.
Well, you very effectively dealt with the issue of environmental justice, broadly defined. And that's not often done in films accurately and well. And also the impacts to the lifestyle, to the life ways would be a better word to use, right? And you started with Alec Perry, who had gone to Denmark with his family and then returned. So there was this reflection on what it means to belong to the land. And he wanted to resume hunting and become a hunter. And so we see it was very artfully done as a director, to see his struggle with his physical ailment, his body and his dreams, kind of paralleled against the struggle of the Arctic itself, to live, and to maintain traditions, traditional lifeways.
Yeah, I think, one of the things with Alec that was so great for us was that he was just so open, and he was so willing to share his story. And, as a counterbalance to him, of course, we also had Matali in Nunavut. Mm-hmm. And both young people, both young Inuit who are trying to figure out what their future is, but their stories, as you've seen in the film, are very similar. Both left the Arctic when they were young. Both have returned. Both are in some way trying to reclaim their cultural heritage and identity, but also look to the realities of what the future is going to be. Of course, for Alec, trying to be a hunter, the changing ice is much more of an immediate threat to him. He can't be taught in the same ways. He's learning from his uncle, but his uncle can't teach him how to read the ice, and he can't teach him how to read the weather because it's not acting in the way it has predictably for generations. And there's less and less hunters in where he lives in Kanuk in Greenland. There's less and less young people who want to become hunters. So it's not just a threat of climate change. It's also a threat of cultural loss. And of course, if you trace the line back in Greenland, they were colonized by Denmark. A few generations prior to when Nunavut was colonized by Canadians, but there's still a historical legacy there. And then on the other side, in Nunavut in Canada, Matali is also trying to reclaim her identity, but it's almost more of an existential thread. There's much more of an immediacy of colonization on the Canadian side. As you saw in the film, this isn't the 19th century. This was one generation ago. I mean, there's a woman in the film in her 50s who was saying that she remembers living a traditional life growing up and then being taken away. This is not ancient history. This is, everything being turned completely on its head very, very recently.
And they were taken away, just to interject, she was taken away because of defense concerns. Is that correct? Like Cold War, wanting to populate areas that have lines of sight out to what submarines may be doing out in the water and things like that?
So the original, in Canada and Nunavut, the original sort of round of colonization really had to do with sovereignty and land claims. And that was around the time of World War II. And that's when, Inuit were very nomadic people, and they had seasonal hunting grounds and seasonal camps. And the government came in, and because they wanted to make sure that they had sovereign claims in the north, they rounded up Inuit families and just relocated them to random communities. There's so much that's not even in the film. There's stories of families' dogs being slaughtered by the RCMP with no explanation. Of course, there's been inquiries, and the RCMP says, well, there was distemper, but the main point is that it wasn't, whatever the reason was, it was never explained. And the same goes for taking children away and putting them in residential schools, which were run by churches. You know, I
Right.
can't speak to what the intent was, but it certainly wasn't communicated to families or people with tuberculosis in communities being taken away and never returning. You know, this all happened in the last 50 years. And uh, that was all, the original thing was land claims. Then during World War II and during the Cold War, yes, there was a very large defense portion of this. And the American military came in, and the DEW line, the distant early warning system, that was
Mhm.
really a big part of development across Nunavut. And again, incredibly disruptive to the culture and incredibly disruptive to family bonds. And one thing that is clear from my talking to people, and I think comes across in the film as well, is that the trauma that was experienced, it's generational and it's
Yeah.
passed down in multiple ways. Of course, it's the same story in a lot of parts of the world. But when the way of life, people were put in these communities, they were made to get jobs so that they were made to rely on outside income sources. They were forced into almost cultural retraining to try and become, the word is civilized, but I put that in quotes, obviously.
Mhm.
um, the effect is still lingering now, and during land claims negotiations with the federal government, obviously this whole other threat of climate change, all the opportunists who are coming in from the outside to try and make profit in the Arctic. I think there's a clash of worldviews, and there's a clash of incentive drivers and success models and success metrics, because
Mhm.
if you're measuring anything that has to do with people or the environment against a quarterly earnings report, or in a lot of cases an election cycle, obviously that's very extremely short-sighted. And I think one thing that a lot of indigenous groups have in common across the world, not all, but many, is that success or something that's sustainable is sort of measured in the long term. In indigenous communities, that at least I've found to be true, is that there's an idea that you can't really call yourself successful or sort of elevate yourself to a higher status if the people in your community are suffering. I mean, I think there's a real focus on together we prevail, or together we sort of fall. Obviously, that's not the incentive in the rest of the world. I don't think that it ever will be. I mean, I would love it if things changed in that direction, but I think that might be an impossible dream. But as long as the sustainability of our energy sources and the world is sort of tied to profit motives and short-term profit motives, I don't think we're ever going to get too far. But I hope that at some point there's a shift in that from a business standpoint.
What expectations or assumptions did you have going in that were revealed to be prescient, and what expectations did you have going in that were revealed to be not realistic to the situation?
Well, I tell myself that when I went up there for the first time, I was totally naive and knew nothing. I'm sure I had some sort of implicit bias about, what I might expect in the Arctic. Um, but in terms of expectation, one thing that I think I thought when I first went up was that Inuit had not been part of the international fight for climate change or part of the international voice. And to some degree, they are marginalized on the international stage, but there's been huge political movement in Nunavut and in Greenland. The ICC with the Inuit Circumpolar Council is a huge group that has done some incredible work on the international stage in terms of negotiating rights, and also things like having chemical compound reduction in the rest of the world, because a lot of the chemical runoff that is in our oceans makes its way up to the Arctic. So that was one thing that I was surprised at and inspired by. In some ways, I had the advantage that so many filmmakers had done it incorrectly before me. And so, in all the initial research, of course, like Nanook of the North comes up. That was such a big one that kept coming up again and again and again, as Inuit themselves pointing to, like, here's an example of someone coming in and sort of misrepresenting, and there's been that still goes on today.
Mm-hmm.
So I had adopted from sort of day one the mantra of just shut up and listen. That's my job when I go up. I am just there to learn, and then also I think that there's a tendency among filmmakers, maybe journalists as well, to go to areas like this and sort of talk to one person and then sort of extrapolate, okay, here's what Inuit think about this, and here's what Inuit think about that. But I also made a sort of priority to never do that. One thing that was really I loved in a lot of the places I went to, actually almost every place I went to in Inuit communities in the Arctic, was the feeling of community. And that was something that at least I hadn't experienced or seen in any of the places I've lived, even in the very small town I grew up in. It's sort of, everybody is looking out for one another. Everyone's always gathering at one another's homes. It's just open. Even in Nunavut, you can just walk into someone's house, assuming you know them. Nobody knocks. It's like one big sort of family feeling. And I think that sort of extends out to that mentality I was talking about earlier of making sure everyone around you is okay. You really, it's sort of a shared well-being. And so I think that that's something I've tried to adopt into my own mentality, and thinking of ways that this film has changed me. I think that might be a big one. I can go up there a lot and sort of feel like I'm understanding how things work and the way of life, but then also always trying to temper that with knowing, like, I'll never really understand what it's like to be Inuk, or living in one of these communities, or having gone through anything like this. So in some ways, it always feels a bit like I always had two audiences in mind in my head when I was making this. There was the world, and people who have no idea that maybe people even live in the Arctic, and then the other audience was Inuit. And obviously that's two very, very different audiences, but I even had, like, the Post-it notes up on my computer while I was editing, just to constantly be reminding myself of that. But that was really important to try and always be thinking through those two lenses.